Hey everybody, my name is Vanessa Hartzell. I'm the Executive Director of Ignite Life, which is a Christian organization that exists to equip, empower, and mobilize women to be the spark that ignites change in the world for the sake of Christ. I was supposed to be with you tonight for Mom Cafe to unpack this whole connection piece, and unfortunately I'm not able to be there, but I wanted to get this information out to you even so because I feel like it really has the opportunity to impact our families, our homes, the way we live out the gospel in our neighborhoods, at our kids' schools. The idea of connection is a really big thing right now because we're living in a season and a time where it's this false sense of connection. We're connected everywhere, every minute of every day. And yet we're seeing the fruit of disconnection, which is ironic, right? We're seeing the fruit of suicide rates going up, divorces rising, dissatisfaction. There was a Gallup survey that just went out that said every single people group in 2020 has experienced more emotional and mental health declines than ever before in history, except for a group of people. And that was the group of people who met consistently at a church gathering. Ironic, right? That as people continue to gather and connect in face-to-face intimately, all of a sudden that group of people experience more mental and emotional health satisfaction. And so that tells us that connection, authentic, life-giving connection, is actually really important and plays a huge part in our daily living. So I realize many of you don't know me, so I'll give you some background, some information about who I am, what I'm about, the craziness that is Vanessa Hartzell. So I am the wife to Evan Hartzell, who is the community pastor at the church at Lake Mead. I am the mother to Owen, Ethan, and Charlotte. Owen is 7.5. We can't forget that. Ethan is 5.5, and Charlotte is just weeks away from turning 3, y'all. And I just sent her to school. She's going to this sweet little preschool. And just 2 days ago, she went to preschool for the first time. And so everyone comes, this will give you some insight into my personality, into who I am. Everyone comes to me and they're like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Like, how is it? Did you cry? And I'm like, no. Crickets, right? Like, no, I don't know if it's just because we're in the first week or what, but I'm like, y'all, I drank my coffee and it stayed hot. I washed my floors. They stayed clean. I got more work done in my whole life than in my whole life that I did in this week. So she's not gone all week long, a few mornings a week. And I miss her. I miss spending time with her, but it's been a rough year. And so this time without my kids has been like precious gold to me. That was not in my notes, but that's just for free. So I'm the executive director of Ignite Life, but my life before this was actually in training and development, where we talked more about growing your emotional intelligence, being the birthplace of where you start to actually understand what's happening around you relationally, even when it doesn't pertain directly to you, having the awareness of where to insert yourself in a conversation and where to back away, when to say something, when to hold your tongue, right? And so I went and worked for an organization that really, I was super young, and it was a Jesus thing that they even let me in the door, let alone work there for a couple years. And after I started to learn more about training and development and growing your emotional intelligence, I realized that's the natural overlap there was with our Christian faith. How much God and the scriptures really exist to increase our emotional intelligence. Like, the world's calling it emotional intelligence. I'm going to call it like sanctified righteous living, right? That we can be aware of other people, learn to serve and love people better. And so that is, as if you couldn't tell, a passion point for me. I really enjoy teaching people, training organizations and people on how to facilitate better connection. So in this world, I don't know if you've been through Ignite Life Speakers Workshop or How to Share Your Story, anything like that, you will have heard of a woman named Brené Brown. I highly recommend that you go out and you buy all her books and you read them all and you look up her TED Talk, and she's brilliant and she'll change your life. Her name is Brené Brown, and she is a researcher, and she researches specifically on shame such a funny thing to research, right? Like, I'm sure it's not fun introducing yourself as a shame researcher, but that's what she does. And as she dug deeper into this shame well, she realized that what kept people in shame was that they did not realize that they were worthy of love and belonging. That when people know and believe that they are worthy of love and belonging, they can fight through shame a lot quicker, faster, easier. And so the things that she says is just gold. And I think it's because not many people have ventured down this road before. And so the insights are new and fresh and they're relevant. Like, I want to read her stuff because it's actually what my life, what I'm walking through in my life, in my marriage, with my kids, with my friends, with my neighbors, right? Like, this is so relevant in our lives. So she gave an equation on connection that really radically changed things for me. And here's the equation. You're going to want to write this one down. It says courage plus compassion equals connection. Courage plus compassion equals connection. I want to break that down. And you're like, it's already pretty broken down. I know what this means, but let's just actually zoom in a little bit and look at what this looks like. So courage, when we think about courage, we think about firefighters running into burning buildings. Am I here to argue that that's not courage? No, absolutely. That is courage, right? We know that courage is these heroic acts, doing the things that no one expects you to do. Courage is also relationally inserting yourself into a conversation where you feel uncomfortable. That's courageous behaviors, right? So if something's happening and I speak up, I mean, you've probably been in this situation before. I believe it's more relevant and present with introverts. It's harder to step in and say something than it is for an extrovert like myself. I can say things all day long, but that's not true once it starts to become vulnerable information. So once I start to share vulnerable information, I'm now entering into courageous territory because I'm sharing with you things that you can't know simply by looking at me. You can't know my fears, my insecurities, right? You can't know my greatest accomplishments. These are all vulnerable things because they're buried. And so it's courageous for me to make known what is not known on the surface. That's courage. Now, if that courage, it says courage plus compassion. So if that courage is now received with compassion, then a genuine connection can be formed. Now, compassion, obviously there's some like on the surface compassion. I don't think any of us, even though I can't see you, I don't believe any of us are lacking compassion to the point of like somebody tells us like their grandma died and we're like, so, right? No, like we have some basic human decency and compassion. But what you should know about me is that compassion and mercy are not at the high end of the scale for me. I have to really dig deep to find compassion and to give space and time to things that deserve it. Because if you're an Enneagram person, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. I like believe in rainbows and sparkles and unicorns and right fairy tales. Like I live in La La Land a lot. I'm super excited about life, about things going on around me, which means I'm very fast paced. I bounce from adventure to adventure to adventure. And so oftentimes my compassion is lacking because I don't give space to things that really deserve time and space. I fill in gaps. I fill in sound gaps, right? And I just move really fast. And so it's difficult sometimes for me to form connection because that space is not given for compassion. So when someone is courageous enough to bring you into their world, if you respond with compassion, it's inevitable for a connection to be formed. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. When someone is courageous enough to bring you into their world, if you respond with compassion, an inevitable connection will be formed. I want you to now take a look at the opposite to be true. Where in your life have you put yourself out there? You were super courageous. You were super vulnerable, only to be met with a lack of compassion. And what happens to your relationship? Inevitably, you take a step back, right? Like I just told you this thing that's super important to me. It was super real. It was super emotional. It was super, right? Like at my core. And when I told you, you laughed, or when I told you, right, you disengaged, or you were like, no big deal. An example I was going through, this is several years ago, I was going through some like girlfriend drama, right? Which isn't a normal for me. I don't really engage in a lot of that, but there was some tension and drama. And as I brought it up to my husband, he looked at me and was like, Vanessa, it'll work itself out. It always does. And I felt myself like take that emotional step back and say, wait a minute. I just shared with you, like, this is something that's really heavy in my life. And your response is it'll work itself out. Like, that is not the compassion I needed. And so instead of us growing closer together in connection, I took a step back and said, oh, wait, maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he, right? And I'm starting to now start my own internal narrative about the story that isn't based on truth at all, which can easily send us spiraling down a rabbit hole. So instead, I said to him, that's not what I needed right now. I needed you to ask me how I'm feeling. I needed you to help me brainstorm what we were going to do about it. I needed that compassion to be there. And because I then spoke up and re-engaged in vulnerability, I shared even more vulnerable things that I was feeling. Our connection had an opportunity to come back together and heal. And I think that that's a piece that often is missing for many of us, especially when it comes to marital, but it really exists in all of our relationships. Once we've been burned, once we've been hurt a little bit after we've put our vulnerable self out there, once we've done that and we're not met with compassion, disconnection happens. It's going to take even more courage than the time before to re-engage, be even more vulnerable, and fight for a connection in that relationship. But that's really what it takes to continue a connection to grow further. If I took a step back and disconnected, and then the next time something happens, it happens again because I never said anything. I disconnect, and then I disconnect, and then I disconnect. Over time, you can see where a husband and wife are sitting there saying like, we're so disconnected. Like, I don't even know who you are. I don't even know, right? I don't even know what you need from me. I don't even know what I can do for you. And it's because these moments of disconnection have happened over and over again where emotionally we were not met with the compassion, but then at the same time, you and I are also not meeting the other person with the compassion that they need. How many times does your spouse actually enter into some vulnerability only for you to be in a hurry with the kids? I mean, that's like the biggest distraction for me for connection is that, all of a sudden my husband wants to enter into this vulnerable, courageous conversation of something that happened at work, a way that he's feeling, something that happened between the two of us. And I'm like, dude, can we just talk about this later? Like, I got to make dinner. It's not the right time, right? And of course that can be true, but there's a compassionate way to go about it. And so this distraction then makes it feel as though I was not demonstrating compassion. And all of a sudden my husband takes a step back emotionally into disconnection, right? So you can see how this plays out in a marital relationship over and over again. I want to give you kind of a silly but very relevant example of how this happened in my life with my son's teacher. So, right, that connection is super important if you're an involved parent, that you want to have a good connection with your teacher, your child's teacher, so that you feel like you can ask questions, ask for things that you need, say you don't understand something, ask for additional help, right? And so I had gone to my son's teacher and she's incredible. I love her, but I can only say that because we've had moments like this where I said to her, hey, my family is going on a trip to Washington to see the rest of our family. Owen's going to be out of school for 2 days. And she said, okay, great. I'll prepare his work for him. Done and done. So it's the last day that he's in school before we go on our trip. And I go to pick Owen up from school and he comes running out to the car with a slip of paper with a lollipop attached to it. I'm like, Owen, what is going on? Like, what is this piece of paper? And he said, my teacher gave me this paper that says, have a safe trip, enjoy this lollipop on the plane. That was the compassion that I didn't even know that I needed to be received with. And let me unpack that with you. I gave her information that she didn't need to know. It didn't actually pertain to her life. She could have taken the part that did pertain to her. Owen's going to be out of class for 2 days. Here's his homework. But instead of only listening to the part that impacted her, she listened to the part that impacted me. She had compassion on it. She recognized it. She called it out. The most important thing to Mrs. Hartzell in this moment is that her family is going on vacation. And so she acknowledged that by celebrating with my son that we were going on vacation, and she sent us out excited. And that really that was the starting point, the birthplace of a friendship with my son's teacher. I think a lot of times we get information and we only respond to the parts that impact our lives personally, not responding to the parts that impact the other person personally. What's most important for them in this moment? That's the part I want to respond to, not just the part that's most important to me. I think that this is just so relevant in the lives of our kids. Most of the things happening in my children's life, I'll be honest, I don't care. Like on a very surface level, right? Like you stayed in the lines while you were coloring. Awesome, right? Like that's super great. And like, I'm trying to facilitate like our home, right? I'm trying to keep all the balls in the air and all the things going simultaneously. And so as my son, who never stays in the lines when he's coloring, he stays in the line. If I'm not careful, he says, Mom, I stay in the lines. And I say, great. That was great, right? And I respond of like, congratulations, good job, bud. And I give this acknowledgement without celebrating the part that was most important to him. He needed a pause. He needed me to be present, to engage in that moment with him, to really affirm, wow, you took your time. You were focused. You were concentrated. You gave it your all, didn't you? Way to go, buddy. I'm so proud. Let's hang that picture up on the fridge so that when daddy gets home, you can share with him what you did today, right? That's the compassion that moments deserve. But too many moments for me, I'm in the survival mode, and there's so much that needs to be done that I swipe and wipe everybody else's needed moments under the rug. Did it form disconnection with my son? I don't think that moment did. But I believe it could have created connection. There are other moments where your child is hurt, whether it be physical or emotional, where we just don't give it the time it deserves and it needs because either we're with friends. Has that ever happened to you? You're at the park and your kid like wipes out, hurts, falls, whatever. But I mean, it could be because I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, but like you're with friends. And so you're talking and you're in the middle of a conversation and they're like, I'm bleeding like all down my body. And you're like, oh, I'm so sorry. Come sit here with me if you need to. And you go back to re-engage in the conversation. Now my middle, Ethan, he is not anywhere close to a 7 on the Enneagram, and things really impact him deeply. Emotionally, things hurt deeply. And so just simply when he gets even disciplined for something he's done wrong, like things hurt deeply. I cannot discipline him the same way I discipline my oldest. My oldest is like, you need to go, you need to get away, you need to like spend some time. Ethan is like, he needs to be held, he needs to be seen, he needs to be told that he's safe, that he's okay, that he's, not on fire. Like he needs that. And so I think sometimes I cause disconnection between my relationship and my son's simply because I don't give the moment what it needs for connection to actually happen. I don't give the compassion that he needs and desires in that moment for a connection to actually take place. So not only realizing the parts that impact me, great, now you're bleeding, now I have to clean it up, now I have to find a Band-Aid, now, right? But acknowledging him, hey buddy, I know that hurt you on your knee, but is your heart okay? Do you need anything from me right now, right? Like slowing the moment down in order to be present. So I've been working really hard on building relationships with my neighbors. I'm kind of the outcast in my neighborhood because they're all Mormon and I'm not. And so I have been just working on building life-giving, authentic relationships with them. And so once a week, a neighbor calls and we all go down to her house and just chat for a minute. And usually on Tuesday mornings, and she gives me donuts for my kids. It's super sweet. And so I've really enjoyed doing that, but I realized our relationship had like plateaued, right? Like at first it was like new and exciting, whatever. And I realized that it plateaued because there was no vulnerability entering into that relationship. And because there was no vulnerability, there was no opportunity to respond with compassion. So our connection was just going to stay where it was. In order for connection to increase, vulnerability must also increase. Compassion must also increase. And so I was standing down there and I overheard one of the moms saying to another mom, her mom was in the hospital and, she didn't know what she was going to do. She was really scared. And so I inserted myself into the conversation and said, I'm so sorry to hear about your mom. Now that's compassion, but it's not unicorn compassion. Like, we need unicorn compassion. The compassion that people are like, what? You did that for me? That was so kind. You didn't have to. That was so thoughtful. Like, we need when it comes to reaching people with the gospel, especially when it comes to growing authentic relationships, we've got to give the unicorn of compassion, the compassion that people don't even know it exists anymore, that it's even real. So I had that moment with her, and then I told her I'd be praying for her and all of that. So I went back home. A week later, I saw her out in front of her house, and so I stopped and I said, hey, how is your mom? And she looked at me like, I can't even believe you remembered that. And I said, how's your mom? Because I know that, last time I saw you, she wasn't doing well. Is she better? How are you? How's your family? And it was a unicorn of compassion because no one remembers anything, right? Like, we don't remember. People tell us things and we're in it in the moment with them, but we don't come back and remember. So the fact that I remembered her vulnerable moment and met her with compassion there, our relationship stepped up a notch. I know that because Christmas hit and she left presents on my door for me. And that is something that never has happened since we've lived here, right? But there was a connection that happened because we entered into vulnerable territory. The unicorn of compassion came out and met her and received her vulnerability well. And so I think that that's something that we constantly have to be looking for. But let's be real. Our lives are moving so fast in so many directions. There's so many distractions. How am I actually supposed to remember every need of every person and every friend that crosses my path? And I think that the answer is that you're not. That's not human. There's so many connections happening right now in the world. I mean, as far as how many people you actually know, that I don't think that's actually supposed to happen. I think what is supposed to happen is that we are to build systems into our lives that allow us to care and love people well. And so here's some systems I have in my life. When I find out that someone is sick, 2 days later on my calendar, I post a event on my calendar. I put a note on my calendar that says, call so-and-so sick. When I hear that so-and-so's mom went into the hospital, when I read it on Facebook, not every person, but the people who have been entrusted to me, right? I can't facilitate that many conversations with that many people and have authentic relationships with that many people. But for people who have been entrusted to me, it's my job to figure out how to love and serve them well. So when I found out that her mom went into the hospital, I made a note of it so that the next time I saw her, I would remember to ask. I associated her with that thing going on in her life, so I'd remember to ask. I have a friend who every time she gets a gift, I need to start doing this because I'm real bad at it. Whenever she gets a gift, before she opens it, she goes and gets a thank you card and she writes to so-and-so and she folds it and puts it on her counter. Then the end of the day comes, and if there's any notes on her counter, she goes and picks it up and finishes writing the note, stamps it, and puts it in the mail. That's brilliant, y'all, right? So we need to come up with systems that allow us to remember what's happening in the lives of people. I have a 30-minute time frame on my calendar where I pray for people who have been entrusted to me. So I can go and put people's names on that event on my calendar so that I can remember them in prayer. When I finish praying for them, I send them a text message that says, I just prayed for you, and this is what I prayed over you. So it's not that I'm this superhuman that can remember to do all these things. I just have systems in my life because connection for me is super important. Maintaining relationships of people who have been entrusted to me is super important. And so developing systems, I'm sure you have your own systems of things that you can do, and you'll have an opportunity to share that with the people who are in the room with you right now, because this is so important. If you think something positive, say it, write it, text it, make it known. Whether that's to your children, to your spouse, to your kid's teacher, to your neighbors, to the Starbucks barista. If you think something positive, let that positive thing make it into the world of the other person. How many times do we lean over to our friend and go, oh my gosh, her shoes are so cute? Like, yeah, okay, but she doesn't know it, and she's the one that needs to be affirmed. She's the one that showed vulnerability today by wearing those shoes, right? So she's the one that needs my affirmation. She's the one that needs my compassion in that moment. So if you think something positive, immediately make that known in their world. I was sitting in church and one of the girls got up there and she was singing, and I was like, her harmony is so good today. So I pulled out my phone during church when I sat down and said, hey, Katie, just wanted to let you know your harmonies were on point and your shirt is cute too. And I let it be known in her world. After church that day, she's like, oh my gosh, Vanessa, I needed that so bad. Thank you for taking the time to let me know. It's just developing. If you think it, make it positive in somebody else's life, and your connection will grow over and over again. The other thing is to ask. We forget to ask, to invite people into vulnerability. So if there's a relationship in your life that you want to grow, the connection to grow, find a way to ask them to be vulnerable, right? And that's not as blunt and blatant as I just said it, but it's finding ways to first demonstrate courageous behaviors in that relationship and allowing them to respond to compassion with you, model that for them, but then also for you to invite them, hey, how are you? And actually listen, hey, how can I be praying for you? How are things going in your family? How are things going with your kids, right? Asking our kids to be vulnerable is a good thing. Hey, tell me something that happened today at school that made you excited. That's vulnerability. Hey, tell me about a friend in your school someone in your school who might need a friend. Tell me about, right? We're inviting people into vulnerability. We're asking our spouse, tell me something about work that frustrates you, right? We're inserting ourselves into that conversation, inviting vulnerability, but know that when you invite vulnerability, it is required of you to respond with compassion. My husband and I do a devotional together every Sunday night, and I've shared it with you before. It's called Closer. It's the best thing ever. And in that devotional, at the end, it has some discussion questions. And the purpose of the discussion questions is to enter into some vulnerable territory. How can I show you love? Like, how do you want me to show you love? How can I serve you better? But you need to know that when you ask those questions, sometimes you might not love the answer. It is still your job to respond with compassion so that connection can grow. That doesn't mean you just sit there and say, like, that was okay, it didn't impact me, no problem. Sure, you can feel that way. No, it means you say, wow, I didn't realize you felt that way. Thank you for sharing it with me. I'm going to work better on doing this, this, and this, right? Like, we have to be willing to respond in compassion if we're going to ask someone to be vulnerable. So as you and I start to look outside of our family and how to actually make Jesus known in our relationships with our friends, with our neighbors, there's a book that I want to share with you some tools from. It's called I Once Was Lost. And the very first step, it says that every person must go through in order to begin a relationship with Jesus, to start that journey, is that they first have to know a Christian. And that might sound very elementary, but they have to know that you're a Christian in order for them to begin having these conversations that would lead anywhere. And I think so many of our friends know that we go to church, They know that our kid goes to Christian school. They know that we're a good person, right? But do they know that you are a Christian, that your life flows out of time in the Word and in prayer and communion with God? And right, do they know that you're actually a Christian that's connected to the person of Jesus? Once they know that about you, then you can go to the second step, which is that they have to trust a Christian. And you know the fastest way to build that trusting relationship with somebody? Vulnerability met with compassion every time. And from there, they continue to step up this ladder to finally starting their own relationship with Jesus. But you and I, if we're going to start those conversations, if we're going to start to lead people in our lives to Jesus and allow the connection we have with them to be fruitful into people knowing the gospel, we have to enter into vulnerability and meet people with compassion over and over again. You're going to have an opportunity right now to get into some smaller groups and have some conversations that might lead you to be vulnerable, conversations that I'm asking everyone in the group to respond with compassion together as you talk about these connections that you're forming in your family, in your marriage, in your neighborhood, in your kids' schools. How are we doing that? And so hopefully these questions will guide you through this information, allow it to become more practical in the way that you walk this out. Thank you for being here. It was so good to spend some time with you, and I look forward to seeing you soon.